So welcome to today's webinar on trauma through the ACE lens, developing trauma-informed classrooms. This webinar is co-sponsored by the Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, or MHTTC, housed at Rutgers School of Health Professions, Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation. My name is Kathy Rivera, and I'm the project coordinator of this center and will be facilitating the webinar today. Next slide, please.
Yeah, oh, there it is, okay.
The MHTTC is funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, to enhance the capacity of the behavioral health and other related workforces to deliver evidence-based and empirically supported practices to individuals with mental illnesses. Please visit the MHTTC Network website for additional information at mhttcnetwork.org. And if you're interested in staying up to date with the events and products the Northeast and Caribbean MHTTC is providing, please sign up to receive our email communications. You can sign up at the bit.ly link provided on the screen. Following the webinar, you'll be asked to complete a brief survey. We value this feedback and use it to improve our activities and inform future activities. These surveys are also important because our continued funding is linked to the completion of these surveys. So we thank you in advance for your feedback. We also want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our website along with the PowerPoint slides in the next couple of days. We encourage you to interact with our presenters during the webinar by using the chat feature. Please post any comments or questions you have in the chat, and I will collect your questions as we go and ask them of the presenter during the Q&A time towards the end of the presentation. During the webinar, our presenter may pose questions to you. Please use the chat feature to answer these questions. This presentation was prepared for the MHTTC network under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. All material appearing in this presentation, except that taken directly from copyrighted sources, is in the public domain and may be reproduced or copied without permission from SAMHSA or the authors. Citation of the source is appreciated. This presentation will be recorded and posted on our website. At the time of this presentation, Eleanor McCants-Katz is serving as SAMHSA Assistant Secretary. The opinions expressed herein are the views of the presenters and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services, DHHS, or SAMHSA. No official support or endorsement of DHHS, SAMHSA, for the opinions described in this presentation is intended or should be inferred. Now let's begin our webinar. We have PJ Wenger with us today. PJ is a licensed professional counselor with over 15 years of experience working as a school guidance counselor. She has also served as a trauma loss responder with the New Jersey Trauma Loss Coalition since 2004. Ms. Wenger has experience as a psychiatric screener, a mental health counselor, and a recreation therapist. She utilizes her extensive experience to provide dynamic professional development seminars and trainings on topics such as youth mental health first aid, QPR, suicide prevention program, SAM play therapy, trauma response to suicide and other traumatic events, and school anxiety and school refusal. So now I'm going to turn it over to PJ, and welcome.
So today our objectives are really to define trauma and the various types of trauma. We're going to explore our adverse childhood experiences, which is the ACE. We're going to let you all kind of play with that a little bit and find out your personal ACE score. We're going to understand how trauma manifests in our lives, the signs and symptoms. We're going to define and understand what a trauma-informed approach looks like. And we're going to learn to create a trauma-informed classroom and address student behaviors to improve their mental health through a trauma-informed lens. So the first thing we really need to do is define trauma. And this is the definition from SAMHSA. The individual trauma results from an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual or physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. The three things that are important in this definition are the event, the experience, and the effects. We call them the 3 E's of trauma. And there's multiple definitions of trauma that have been given out over the years. APA's definition is a response to a terrible event, an emotional response to a terrible event. And then we have Brer and Scott, who identify it as something that's extremely upsetting, that overwhelms a person's internal resources, their ability to cope, and produces these long-lasting psychological symptoms. And lastly, we have exposure to an experience or an event, or a series of events that may be frightening. This is the National Center for Child Traumatic Stress's definition. But the reality is that trauma is experienced by the individual, and what may traumatize one individual may not traumatize another individual. A particular event may be experienced traumatically for one person, but not another. For instance, children who grow up in the same home, and one child exhibits some of those post-traumatic stress symptoms, whereas another child may not. We see veterans coming home from war zones, and same condition. Some of those veterans will experience some symptoms of the traumatic experiences that they have been exposed to, and others will not. What really defines the trauma is how the individual assigns meaning to it. So there was a great example of 2 guys who were in a convenience store. The convenience store was robbed at gunpoint. While the 2 individuals were there, they were both asked to lay down on the ground while the perpetrator emptied the cash box and knocked out the cash register person and fled the building. Afterwards, one of those victims was on the phone, posting on Facebook, telling everybody what happened. Can you believe this happened? This was so wild. I can't believe I was part of this. While the other person was curled up in a ball in a corner and unable to move. So that just shows you how 2 people in the exact same situation can experience it completely different. There's a lot of factors that go into that, and we're going to talk about that. But it's really how a person assigns meaning to the event and how it disrupts our physical and psychological ability to function and deal with it. So the long-lasting effects of an event are a critical component of the trauma. These adverse effects may occur immediately or may have a delayed onset. Again, a veteran who's in battle may not experience any of those symptoms, but when he returns home may begin to have symptomology. These are just some trauma facts that I want you to see so that you can see how common it is for people to experience trauma. So if we think about 2/3 of the children in your school can identify a traumatic event by the time they reach age 16, that's a lot of children. And again, we know the duration of the effects can be short-term or long-term. In some situations, the individual may not even recognize the connection between the traumatic event and the effects they're experiencing. So, you know, some of the other things that we know, 1 in 4 high school students have been in a physical fight, and that doesn't necessarily mean a physical fight in school. 1 in 5 students have been bullied, and we certainly have had enough training and presentations about bullying that we know that that really affects students. And cyberbullying right now is huge. There is a lot of things going on over the social media with the social distancing that the children are experiencing. National average of child abuse and neglect victims in 2013 was 679,000. That is a lot of children. And we know right now with COVID that we are seeing domestic violence rates go up. We are seeing mental health issues like depression and anxiety go up. We're also seeing that there is a lot more substance abuse, which again sometimes causes abusive situations in homes. Again, here we are, 19% of injured and 12% of physically ill youth have PTSD. Post-traumatic stress disorder, for those of you who may not know that acronym. We've had families affected by a disaster, a flood. We had a school contact us the other day, and they are still recovering from some of the effects of Hurricane Sandy. And, you know, that was years ago. 70% of US adults. So I want you to keep that number in mind. So when we do our ACEs and people are feeling oh my gosh, like I have a lot of trauma and I didn't really think it was trauma. 70% of US adults have experienced one traumatic event in their lives. And so just to give you a visual of that number, I love the last statistics, because if we think about a football stadium and if we filled every seat in 9 stadiums, those would be the number of youth requiring hospital treatment for physical related injuries. It's a pretty big number. So we're going to talk about the types of trauma. There are 4 types that we're going to address today. Acute trauma, which is a single traumatic event, could be a sudden loss or a physical or sexual assault that happens on a one-time occurrence. We have chronic trauma, which is multiple and varied events like domestic violence, a serious car accident where there's lots of surgeries following it, a victim of community violence. Some of the children I work with in inner cities talk about how the sound of gunshot does not even make them jump or surprise them or startle them anymore, because they're so accustomed to it that it's happening all the time. Again, we have complex trauma. That's multiple interpersonal traumatic events from a very young age. So this is where we identify our emotional abuse, our physical abuse to children, our sexual abuse over years to children. Constant neglect can also be a traumatic event. And secondary trauma, which we're really not going to address today, but secondary trauma is the trauma we as providers sometimes experience because of the people that we're working with who have been traumatized. So because they're relaying to us a traumatic event, it is so much out of our scope of perspective that sometimes we become traumatized. Or if we work with trauma situations for a long period of time, we can develop secondary trauma. It's one of the things as a trauma responder, when we're out with teams, we pay very close attention to our responders on site to make sure that everybody is able to handle whatever it is the situation is that we're on. And sometimes we do excuse people to go home because they're not doing well. So again, not a bad thing, we just need to recognize it. So we're going to look at adverse childhood experiences. And this was a study that came out of the CDC. And what it did is it looked at how our childhood experiences, our adverse childhood experiences, the ones that are traumatic, really affect our lives at a number of levels. It's one of the largest investigations that looked at childhood abuse and neglect and household challenges, people with mental illness in the household or people with substance abuse issues in the household, and their effects on later life health and well-being. So we're going to administer the ACE. You're going to take it. You don't have to report your score to me. This isn't certainly about, telling your colleagues whether you have a high number or a low number. It's really for your own understanding, because we really need to understand where our trauma comes from in order to be able to address children who have trauma. So I'm just a little warning there. Some of the questions may be difficult to think about and may bring up some, uncomfortable feelings. I'm just going to ask you to stay with that. So I'm just going to ask you to record your yes responses. So I'm just going to read through them. You can read through them. You can record your yes responses. So the first question, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you? Or act in any way that made you afraid that you might be physically hurt? Question 2, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? And again, we're just recording our yes responses. Question 3, did an adult person at least 5 years older than you ever touch or fondle you, or have you touch their body in a sexual way? Or attempt or actually have oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse with you? Number 4, did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special? Or your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? And I just sometimes people ask me, well, what if some of these things happen, but the person wasn't 5 years older than me? Or, how do I respond to that? And I would tell you to respond to that with yes, if the experience was traumatic to you. 5, did you often or very often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, and had no one to protect you? Or your parents were too drunk or high to take care of you or take you to the doctor if you needed it? Number 6, were your parents ever separated or divorced? Number 7, was your mother or stepmother often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her? Or sometimes or often or very often kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, or hit with something hard? Or ever repeatedly hit at least a few minutes or threatened with a gun or a knife? And although the question is about a mother or a stepfather, if you had a mother who did these things to a father, that would also include in this category. Domestic violence is not always male to female. It can be reversed. Number 8, did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic or who used street drugs? Number 9, was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide? And again, with this question, that doesn't mean that the person had to be necessarily diagnosed. If you had a mother who stayed in bed for days at a time and didn't get out of bed because she was depressed but never got treatment, that would certainly count. And the last question, number 10, did a household member go to prison? So add up your yes answers, and this is your ACE score. We're going to talk about what that score means. And again, I want you to remember that statistic, 70% of adults have had at least one traumatic event. So it's not uncommon for people to have scores of 1 through 4. Scores over 4, we certainly recommend you looking into getting some help because it does affect your life, and we're going to look at that. So what does your ACE score mean? And again, this is just so you can see that ACE scores are very common. So what we found when they did the ACE originally, when they were doing the study, is that 27% of household dysfunction, people have substance abuse. Parents who are separated and divorced, and these numbers I'm sure have gone up in the last several years. Just from the statistics we're seeing, mental illness, again 17%, but what we know is there was a lot of undiagnosed mental illness years ago. Battered mothers, and I would say battered fathers, because again, domestic violence goes both ways. Criminal behavior, abuse, psychological, physical, or sexual, and neglect, emotional or physical. So these are the numbers that they had years ago. And so I'm trying to make sure that nobody feels that they are strange because they have an ACE score. When I first did my ACE score, it was a 5. So I was sitting there right in the middle, and I was pretty surprised. So what does the ACE score mean? This is what we know from the research, that when we have an adverse child experience, if we don't address it or, understand it or understand how it affects us or how it makes us operate in our lives, and we're going to talk about some of that, it causes social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. As we go up the pyramid, we adopt health risk behaviors, maybe smoking or drinking or gambling or eating too much, and these things then in turn cause disease and social problems and sometimes disabilities, and eventually lead to early death. So what the research was really trying to do was identify this adverse child experience as early as we can in children so that we can eliminate it from harming their lives later on down the road. And it's really very, very important because it causes so many things to happen that we'll see as we look into it. So, again, how ACEs affects our lives, it definitely disrupts our neurodevelopment. So children's brains, we're going to look at that a little bit. It definitely affects our social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, how we interact with other people, our relationships, certainly the adoption of health risk behaviors, like I said, smoking, drinking, those kinds of things. And it has an impact on our life expectancy, how many years we will live, and the disease and disabilities we will encounter. And then again, it can lead to early death. So trauma symptoms are in our entire body. And I use this visual because it affects every single part of our body. So when we think that, oh, that wasn't that bad. And sometimes when I'm working with teens, I did this at a center for teens who are kind of at risk and they're in a program. And one of the teens walked up to me afterwards and he said, I didn't score anything on this trauma scale. And I said, well, that's actually a good thing. That means that, you know, you had a good childhood and you grew up in a good home that was supportive of you. And he says, well, but I really wanted to know if you would consider me getting shot as a traumatic event. And I was surprised that he asked the question, because he really, because of the neighborhood he grew up in and so many of his friends had been shot, he really didn't think of that as a traumatic event, but then went on to talk about some of the things that he experiences, like some nightmares and phantom pain and still problems at the site and problems going down the street where he was shot. And we began to talk about those. And he really made the connection that, oh, these are because I was traumatized by that event, even though, again, on that 1 to 10 scale, it did not come up in the trauma information. There is a life event scale that is more extensive, but it's much longer to administer, and which is why we use the ACE scale. But you can look that up, life event scale, and certainly take that one if you want to do something more extensively. But trauma affects us emotionally, behaviorally, cognitively, physically. It affects our relationships, our interpersonal relationships with family, friends, colleagues, peers, and it does change our perception of the world. And we're going to look at that because that's a really important piece for when we're looking at children. So trauma symptoms, we're going to look at all of these individually. So biologically, what we know is that trauma actually changes the brain. The physical structure of the brain is dynamic. It is not static. It's why when people get a concussion, there's issues afterwards. Brain structure interacts with brain functioning. That's a really important thing to remember. And it actually, trauma has changes in our physiology. I'm going to show you two brains in a few minutes. But we have people who have a lot of trauma in their lives actually have a smaller brain size. Smaller brain size causes a lower IQ. Remember that brain structure interacts with brain functioning. There's a smaller corpus callosi, which is the part of the brain that connects the right and left hemisphere. So there's a disconnect. Sometimes we have cortical atrophy, which means the brain stops growing. Typically, we see this in scans, PET scans, and of people who have Alzheimer's disease. But that can be a result of a physical abuse in a child, which will have the same looking brain scan as a 83-year-old with Alzheimer's. So that's kind of scary if you think about it in those terms. And it results in developmental delays and memory issues. So the same things we see in people with dementia and Alzheimer's, we sometimes see in children. They just don't understand it. So it actually, looking at how the brain works. So sometimes when a child, there's a stimulus, the first part of our brain that picks that stimulus up is our hypothalamus, which is our sensory detector. It kind of, all our senses are on that. Sight, sound, hearing, touch, taste, any sound, any of our senses that are activated by whatever that stimulus was. A typical person, the next part of the brain that gets activated is the cortex, because we use information that we have in our brain to make decisions about how I'm going to react to it. And then, of course, the next part of the brain that gets involved is the amygdala, which is our emotional computer and our alarm system. But because we've processed the information and we've decided whether it's a safe stimulus or a stimulus I need to move away from, then it's a little bit slower time to our response, and our response is more appropriate. Now, for the person who has some brain issues where their brain has been structurally changed, the stimulus happens and it goes right to our hippocampus, which is our most recent memories, and then it goes to our amygdala and we have a response. For the child who's really traumatized, it goes right from that sensory translator, that hypothalamus, right to our amygdala, and they have an immediate response. They don't think about, they don't use any informations, they don't, do any of this cognitive sort of processing that the other two routes show. They go right to a response. It's why if I walk up to a child, for instance, and I see they're having difficulty and I put my hand on their shoulder to say, hey, how you doing? And they immediately turn around and go, don't touch me. That stimulus went right from their sensory translator to their alarm system because they are living in a trauma brain. So just so you can see how that works from a typical person to a traumatized person. And again, just to show you the root without all the other words in it, you know, stimulus, hypothalamus, alarm system, response. It's really quick. It's like a snap of the fingers. So here's a picture of two brains, and this was done by a study by Dr. Perry, who did a lot of brain scans on children who were traumatized and children who were not. And you can actually see these images are not altered. They're not played with. The right brain, the image on the right, is a Romanian orphan who suffered a lot of deprivation. You can see that it's smaller. It has enlarged ventricles, and it has some holes in the center of the brain. And you can see how much smaller it is than the one on the left. So again, you know, we're just looking at another scan that you can see how unhealthy that right brain looks. So if that right brain is so much smaller than a typical brain, just think about how hard it is for that child to function. So affective trauma symptoms, these are some of the symptoms that we see in children. And again, the fear is not just, you know, I'm afraid of you because you're yelling. The fear comes from these frightening memories, intrusive memories that they might be having in their brain all day long while you're up there teaching, or having nightmares at night. So they come to school and they're sleeping and they can't wake up. They will experience the same reactions when exposed to the reminders of the traumatic event. So for instance, if a child was in a car accident, when they pass the scene of the accident on a normal day, just driving to get ice cream or driving to school, they will have a reaction to that passing scene of the accident, just like it was happening to them at that moment. So again, you know, sadness and depression, you know, we see that a lot, and sometimes we don't pick that up in children as being a trauma symptom, and it absolutely is, because it's an abrupt loss of trust in the other people, and they don't trust the world. So they are sad, and they may have suicidal ideation, or they may be cutting. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well. Anger, you know, we see a lot of kids that are angry because of something that's happened to them. And what we see in front of us is the child who's non-compliant, or who has rages or tantrums, or might be physically aggressive towards other kids in the class, or break things. And again, it's not because they're necessarily misbehaving. It's because they are reacting to their internal triggers. You know, they've gone from that hypothalamus right to a response. And then negative self-image. They may think that the event is their fault, or if they had done something differently. So for the child whose father comes home and beats his mother, the child may think, oh, you know, I'm bad because I didn't do my homework, and that's why dad got mad, and that's why he hit mom. So they begin to develop this really negative image of themselves, and begin to think that things are their fault. We see behavioral symptoms and avoidance. So children who have been traumatized do demonstrate a lot of avoidance. They will avoid thoughts, they'll avoid people, they'll avoid places or situations that trigger the recollection of their traumatic experience. And the part of the guessing game on our part is we don't know, unless we really have conversations with children, what those triggers might be. And it's really important for us to know those things. So for instance, back to the example where I put my hand on the child and the child reacted so, I don't want to say violently, but so reactive, that was because that touch triggered something in them of some traumatic event that was not a good event for them. So, you know, another example of avoidance is if, you know, a boy is at school and he is molested in the showers. Sometimes eventually what will happen is that boy will stop showering altogether, both at home and at school, because the act of showering brings back those memories of being molested. And that is not an uncommon reaction. Self-injury, the reason that children self-injury is because those intrusive thoughts that are in their head that are so traumatic, they just want to get some relief. They want to, be able to feel or have a reaction, they want to get rid of some of that unbearable pain that they feel and they can't describe, because children can't say to you, I'm traumatized, or I have this trauma event. They can't say that to you. So they act it out, and we have to figure it out. So we have to be detectives a little bit. Traumatic bonding. This is the Stockholm syndrome. The child who comes to school with a mark on them, and then you report it to Children Protective Services. And of course they go out to the home, and there's all kinds of things that happen after that. And then the child is very angry at you and says, oh, daddy didn't mean to hurt me, and he's a good daddy, and I love him very much. And they will defend the person. That's kind of the Stockholm syndrome. Avoiding healthy age-appropriate peer interactions. This is when children really begin to make friends with children who are younger than them, because it's just easier. Younger children don't ask a lot of questions, so they don't have to tell them a lot of things. Or they will also align themselves with high-risk kids. They'll begin to do some high-risk behaviors because they think that other children won't like them or won't understand. Sometimes children will overfunction and be very parentified. So in school, sometimes that looks like the child who does everything for everybody and does everything for the teacher and is always taking care of things. And sometimes, in a classroom setting, that can be really nice to have a child that helps, but it may not be appropriately motivated. And then of course the tantrums, which, we do see, and that is their inability to really regulate those emotions. So then we have some cognitive symptoms. Inaccurate cognitions. These are the things that children think. So they have these thoughts that are really inaccurate. Because I can't trust mom, then no one in my life is trustworthy. Because dad left, all men leave. So it's kind of this inaccurate cognition. And then they have some irrational ones, blaming themselves. He sexually abused me because I wore a dress. I heard that once from a child. Who thought it was her fault because that's what happened. Or, I didn't go to bed on time and that's why that happened. So the really hard ones though are these last two. Children can really lose faith, and it's not necessarily in God, although sometimes that can be something they question. If they come from a religious home or religious background, they may then be angry at God because this thing happened to them, or they may think there is no God. But it's really a loss of faith in the future. So, we had a child whose brother died in a violent crime in their neighborhood. And he just lost faith that he was ever going to make it to adulthood. There were so many teens around him who were getting shot or locked up that he just said, I might as well just start taking risks because there's no future for me. There's nothing, I'm not going to make it to 21. I'm going to die by the time I'm 18. It's really hard to sit with that sometimes with a child. And then unhealthy relationships. They don't trust people. They have low self-esteem. So it's really hard to be in a relationship where you don't trust the other person. Anybody who's had a partner who's cheated on them, even when they were just dating, way back when you were in school, that leaves a residual mark. And again, trust is one of the bases for relationships. So then we have some interpersonal trauma, and that's interpersonal is my relationships with other people. So I might withdraw from my peers. And the withdrawal is not because I want to be alone. The withdrawal is because I'm shameful about the experience, that I don't want to share it with other children because they might not understand how I'm feeling. So, and I'll just give you a sort of scenario of how this plays out. So, there was a situation where a child was sexually abused at night. And so she began to avoid all the things that happened at night. So she stopped sleeping over at her friend's house. And then her friend kept inviting her, and she kept turning the invites down. And then eventually her friend thought she didn't want to be her friend anymore because she kept refusing her invites. And so the friend eventually stopped being friends with her. So on top of the traumatic event, she now has another loss that she has to deal with because she can't explain to her friend that, you know, this is what happened, because children really don't think anybody else is going to understand. And so again, that ties right into difficulty in doing activities. They no longer see anything to, you know, all those sleepovers that she did prior to the abuse, she can no longer do anymore. She doesn't enjoy them. They're no longer fun for her. So they begin having trouble establishing relationships or keeping relationships or maintaining relationships because they don't know how to have them anymore. And so sometimes they might begin to affiliate with high-risk peers. Again, part of that loss of faith, and then part of that, you know, I can do these behaviors and I don't ever have to explain what's going on with me. I don't ever have to talk about it. I don't ever have to feel those things. And so, you know, sometimes they go down that path. And then we have changes in the perception of the world. And this is the really hard part for kids. So again, they don't think they belong. And they don't belong because they're different or there's something wrong with them. They really lose hope that there's any future for them, that anybody's going to ever love them, that they're going to have friends. And of course, in the case of the little girl with the sleepovers, her friend left her. So it sort of reinforces her belief that nobody's going to want to, you know, be friends with me. I don't belong anywhere, even though, again, those two little girls had very different perceptions of what was happening there. They really look at themselves and the world as good or bad. They're the bad kids and the rest of the kids are the good kids. They don't see opportunity. I'm gonna read you a little excerpt from someone who talked about how the trauma affected her ability to see opportunity for herself. They do become scary. The world is not a safe place, and school is not a safe place, and home is not a safe place. And again, the world is unsafe. So it's scary all the time. So imagine that you are scared all the time. And that's how some of these children live who have come from trauma. The other thing is they can't count on anything. Everything in the world is unpredictable. So when we as providers aren't predictable, if we fly off the handle, if we lose our temper, if we lose our cool, we reinforce to them that the world is unpredictable. And then the last one is they really don't see that there's anything out there to help them. They don't see that there's any person to help them. They don't see that there's anything to help them. So again, I just want you to read, this is a trauma survivor's account. I remember crying in the night. I found it difficult to hear Mrs. Patterson when she spoke in the classroom. I felt as if she were speaking from beneath tumbling water or from the end of a long tunnel. She assumed I was daydreaming. I stopped imagining that I might one day be a teacher. No longer did my imagination dance me through the leaves. The sound of ringing church bells irritated me. Mostly, I felt ashamed and different. And again, this is an account from a real trauma survivor. So again, you know, when we're looking, and that's not to say that all kids are trauma, you know, children of trauma, but we certainly want to begin to look at things differently. You know, there are kids who just daydream, but there are kids who daydream for a reason. So again, the 3 E's of trauma, I already talked about them: the event, the experience of the event, and the effect of the event. And again, this is not linear, it is dynamic all the time. This is what we are trying to create. So what is a trauma-informed approach? So trauma-informed approach is the 3 R's. We like 3's, 3 E's, 3 R's. The 3 R's. So we realize how much trauma impacts the children that we're working with, and we understand those potential paths for recovery. We recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma, and sometimes they can look like other things, but we recognize that there's signs and symptoms of trauma in everyone: students, family, staffs, other people involved in the system. Sometimes parents don't want to come into schools because they had such a negative experience in their school childhood that they are afraid to come into school, or they feel that it's the school against them, or they don't feel welcome. And that's because of their trauma. It has nothing to do with us as people in the building. It has to do with what happened to them. So even though they love their children and they want to support them, their traumatic experience keeps them from coming in the building. And responding. So once we realize the impact, we recognize the signs and symptoms, then we respond with all of this integrated knowledge about trauma, and we
filtrated into every system, our policies, our procedures, our practices, our methods of discipline, our routines in school, because we are actively trying to not re-traumatize children. So again, the 4 R's, and these are not linear R's either. You know, sometimes we go back, sometimes we realize the trauma, but sometimes we don't recognize the symptoms and we respond differently. And then we have to go back to recognizing the symptoms and responding in a different way. So the 6 principles of trauma-informed approach. This is what we're really striving for. So these are the things that we really need to consider when we are looking at a trauma-informed approach. And safety is the number one, always the number one, because it's so huge. And it has to be safe for the staff as well as the students. So sometimes we're all looking at our students, but we as staff members don't feel safe. And then again, if we don't feel safe, how can a child feel safe? Because children play off of us. So if they sense that we are frightened or we are scared, they will have the same reaction. And it has to be safety that's all around: physical safety, psychological safety, emotional safety. If I'm a child and I see staff fighting and calling each other names or being disrespectful to each other, then the environment is not safe for me because I'm afraid that that might happen to me. Trustworthiness and transparency. This is the goal of operations in a trauma-informed approach. And the goal is to build and maintain trust, not only with the students, but the families and among the staff and others involved in the organization. It's really to bridge those gaps that, you know, we're here to help each other. We're not competing. We're not less than. We're not more than. We are all in this together. So one time, one of my schools hired a mental health service to come in and do some additional mental health to give the counselors some relief. And they hired 2 people who set up in a room in the school. And what happened was the group decided that the criteria to see a child for a mental health issue was so specific that most children did not fit the criteria, even though the counselors felt that they needed to be seen. And they ended up seeing maybe 12 children in a school of about 1,300. So again, the counselors were very frustrated because they thought this was going to be people to help them. And additionally, these 2 counselors did not talk to the counselors in the school about what was going on with the children. They couched it under the umbrella of confidentiality, except they were all counselors. And so it became very antagonistic, and it was not a good trauma-informed approach because you had 2 groups in the school not working together and not trusting each other and not supporting each other. So see how that everyone in it really has to work. Even agencies that we bring in and we're working with have to be on board with this. Peer support. This is mutual self-help. You know, key tools to establishing safety and hope and building trust is we enhance, you know, the collaboration. We support our peers and enhance the collaboration, and we utilize their stories to promote healing and recovery in the case of children and family members. So that leads us into that collaboration and mutuality, where the importance of partnering and leveling power differences between staff and students and clerical and administration. That's where the healing happens, is in relationships. And what we know from the research is that we as counselors, the most important thing is relationship when you're doing counseling. It's one of the things when I have a private practice, so when parents bring their children to me, my first little spiel to them is, I will see your child, I will assess them, and then I will tell you how I can help them. But at that moment, that child needs to be able to say that they can work with me or not work with me, because if we don't have a connection, the therapy is useless. And I have parents who sort of are horrified at me, and they say, well, what if we like you? And I say, well, that's great. I love that you like me, but it's not about you and me. It's about your child, and they have to make a connection. So those relationships is where the healing happens, and it happens in meaningful sharing of power and decision making. Everyone has a role in the trauma approach, which again leads us into the next principle, which is empowerment, voice, and choice. And it's really looking at the individual strengths and experiences and recognizing them and building upon them. So for administrators, it's looking at the staff and saying, well, this one is really good at this, and this person's really good at this. And how about if we allow them to really run with their skills and abilities, but we need somebody to do this other thing over here. So let's see if we can bring that piece, lift that piece up so that we're all doing it together. It's fostering a belief in the ability of individuals and organizations that heal and promote recovery from trauma. Students are supported in shared decision-making, choices, and goal setting. And sometimes I have people look back at me and they say, oh, so the kids are going to run the school now. No, it's not about the children running the school. It's not about the staff running the school. It's not about the administration running the school. It's about everyone running the school. Because sometimes, children connect with the cashier in the cafeteria, or they connect with the custodian, or they connect with the secretary, so it's everyone. And again, we really cultivate that self-advocacy skills, speaking up for themselves, having a voice, being listened to. And then cultural, historical, and gender considerations are always something that actively moves the organization past stereotypes and biases that are based on religion, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, age, gender, identity, geography, whatever it is. If we have, so a lot of places in New Jersey, we have stigma-free campaigns going with the trauma coalitions. If we're doing that in a school and everybody's wearing their green t-shirts, that's stigma-free mental health, and everybody's wearing their green armbands, but one of the people in the school is saying, well, I don't believe in all that anxiety, depression stuff. I just think students use that as an excuse. That does not help our children who may be having some trauma. So we're going to look at each of these separately so we can see what we do. So classroom arrangements, and sometimes this is difficult because of space limitations, but we want to try to minimize crowding and distractions for children. Some children can't sit near the window. Sometimes we have to have the blinds down. Sometimes we have to rearrange desks. We need to be flexible to be able to do that. And it's not punitive. We're not placing kids in places in the room for punishment. That we have sufficient staffing. That there are people in the classroom that can help, that children are supervised at all time. That helps them to feel safe, and not supervised yelling at them, just supervise somebody being there. Do you need help? That we establish routines. This is really important, to have really explicit classroom routines and directions. And it's not your whole wall is filled with directions. It's we really think about what is important and what creates safety. So, one that I always go to is we have a hands-off rule in our classrooms, because we don't want people to be putting their hands on other people, and that creates safety. If there are any changes, we warn children about changes. We prepare them for that. And we've become really good at doing that for our kids who are on the spectrum. But what we don't realize is that children who are traumatized really need that as well in order to feel safe. We refrain from interactions that could be shaming or scolding in front of peers. If I need to address a child, I address them in the hallway, or I take them out of the room, or I meet them after school, or something like that. We refrain from negative labels. And again, what we might think is a negative label, someone else might not, but if we avoid the labels altogether, it is not traumatizing. We refrain from power struggles with children and verbal sparring. It just is not helpful at all. And again, not healing. If we are able to maintain a calm demeanor, if we're able to model emotional control, if we're able to model self-regulation through things like breathing or relaxation techniques or things like that, that helps to create safety for a student. And I like to tell staff when I'm doing that, incorporate these things into your classrooms, because it helps you too. If we do 3 minutes of a breathing exercise and I am the person leading the breathing, my autonomic nervous system also settles down as well, not just the students in my classroom. And then because that I am grounded and settled, I am able to concentrate. It helps so much better. Trustworthy and transparency, this again, stakeholder decision making. Who are the stakeholders? The students, the families, the staff, the clerical staff, the administration, everyone. So when we're doing something in the school, we bring everyone to the table to hear everybody's opinions and input and make really good decisions. We are very clear about what our expectations are, so that, you know, we can communicate that to our children. I expect you to keep your hands off each other. I will keep my hands off of you. This is what we expect. So that children are very clear with the expectations. Sometimes we're a little vague, or sometimes we can be sarcastic as adults, and that is not, children who come from a traumatized background do not hear sarcasm. So again, they're going to take you at whatever it is you say, and they're going to miss that it was a sarcasm, or maybe you were joking or something like that. Display and review schedules. This is that in keeping with the safety. We also have that up there so that children know what's going on. It also helps them to look forward to something that they love. So if I'm a child and I'm not really good at math, but you have up there that we're going to have a spelling bee and I rock at spelling, I can look forward to that. And so again, it does multiple things. When we're listening to children, you know, we're exploring a problem, you know, really listen. Not listening with, oh my gosh, this is like the third time I've heard this, or, oh, this is no big deal and I got to get back to math, or really listening to children. It's really the hardest thing that, even when I'm doing couples therapy, it's the hardest thing to teach people to really listen. And that's an important piece, because children know if you're not listening to them. They get it right away. When we do have consequences, we deliver them consistently and calmly. We don't lose our cool. We keep our emotions in check. You know, and again, if we know that our emotions are getting the best of us, we need to model something good. So I am really angry at this moment. I need to just walk away from you for 3 minutes and sit down and pull myself together, and then I will come back. You know, again, I regulate my emotions so that I'm modeling to them how it's done. And then our consequences logically match, you know, the misbehavior. We don't give them 3 days detention for getting up to use the pencil sharpener in the middle of a test, or, you know, we really have to think about that. And then when we do give a consequence, we have restorative conversations following the disciplinary action. You know, you hit Bobby, there's a consequence for that, but tell me what was happening. What is going on? Because oftentimes children will say, nobody listens to me. You know, they didn't see that Bobby was calling me names or writing notes on his desk about me or passing notes about me. You know, so we punish the behavior that we see, but we may not know what comes underneath that. And that's the restorative conversation that really needs to happen. You know, again, actively listening, delivering consequences appropriately, ones that match the behavior. Restorative strategies, I already talked about that. Peer support. And this is where it's really knowing our own traumas. Because one of the worst things that you can say to a child who has been traumatized is, I know how you feel. You know, I think that went out a long time ago for any of us in the field to say, I know how you feel. It's really, tell me how you feel. Tell me how that affects you. Tell me how that looks in your life. You know, opportunity exists for, you know, children to learn how to interact effectively with others, with you, with their peers. You know, so maybe we have role plays, or we have skits that we do with kids, and we have each one take a part and see how they would do it. And then we do some of the corrections, you know, helping students to understand how their behavior affects others. Sometimes they don't understand. We don't do that publicly, but again, helping them to understand that when they blow up, that sometimes that is frightening for other children. Sometimes it's frightening for me because you are so out of control and I don't know how to help you. You know, and sometimes, you know, people will look at me and they say, well, I don't want kids to know that I'm afraid of them. It's not being afraid of them, because I want to be careful not to say I'm afraid of them, because then again, that just reinforces that there's something wrong with them. It's, I'm afraid of the behavior and how it affects you. That's what we want to say. We discourage bullying, and that's bullying among staff. It's bullying from staff to kids. It's bullying among kids. It's bullying anywhere. And then we model respectful behaviors. Children do what they see. They don't do what we tell them. So children model from us. They watch us all the time. Collaboration and mutuality. This is when we really look at student strengths and interests, and we really capitalize on them and really bring them to the forefront. So we lift up their strengths and interests, and we try to pull up their weaknesses. You know, so for oftentimes in schools, children can't play ball unless they have a C average or better, but ball's where they really excel. And that's not to throw out all the rules, but it's to take that child and really help them to see that playing ball is worth it, and so are these other things. So playing ball is their strength, but I'm going to lift up this other thing so that they can do it. And I'm going to give them resources to do that. That there are participation opportunities. Multiple opportunities to respond and participate, you know, during instruction, during the school day. So in one of my schools, there were a group of kids and they didn't really fit in, and they were really very much into anime. So, you know, we suggested, you know, why don't you form an anime club, you know, make a proposal, go to the principal, sit down, say, this is what you want to do. And they did, and they got a teacher to sponsor it. And so after school, once a week, they would have anime club where they would either watch an anime, or they would draw anime, or they would, you know, talk about the characters. One time they dressed up as the characters. So again, those kids who didn't feel like they fit anywhere, I created an opportunity for them to participate, you know. And then flexible behavior management. We really need to be flexible, because sometimes that strict compliance with the rules doesn't work, and it creates a power struggle. And that doesn't mean that we don't have any rules. But we have to be able to flex a little in these situations where maybe that strict compliance isn't working. And then the last one is staff self-care, which I am very big on. And through this COVID, we've done a lot of staff self-care. And I had one educator say to me, if one more person tells me to do yoga, I'm going to scream. And I got it. But I said, you know, what we are finding in the field of trauma is that body work is really important. Getting people back into their body, getting them grounded, getting them to relax, getting that autonomic nervous system, which is way into hyperdrive when we are anxious or depressed or fearful, we're getting that to come back down to a low level so that we can function. So staff self-care, whatever you do, even if you go for a walk out in nature and you count how many turtles you saw that day, or you count how many birds you saw, but something that gets you back in your body, back into nature. Really important for staff self-care right now. Plus, again, you're modeling for the students. Empowerment, voice, and choice. You know, multiple modes of learning. I know for me, I'm very much an experiential learner. I like to do things. I like to learn by doing things. So, you know, when I was becoming a therapist, I did get into the play therapy part of it, the sand tray, because that's very experiential, and I find that really works for some kids. It doesn't work with everybody, but again, I have multiple modes where they can learn in. Some kids learn better by being talked to. Some kids learn better by hearing, by seeing, by doing. So again, we put all that in. Skill development. You know, there are definitely some places where we can develop skills and build positive self-identity, because when kids can accomplish things, they do feel better about themselves. And that's that whole piece of lifting up their strengths and skills and pulling up the areas where they're weak. Positive self-identity. Again, all those things where we can highlight a child and lift up their strengths is really a place where their self-identity also gets lifted up. And ability to make choices, you know, and again, I tell people, give them 2 choices that you can live with, but they get to pick one. So they feel like they're having some investment in it, that they're making a choice and that works for them, and both choices work for me. Again, student strengths, shared decision-making, you know, do you guys want to have your test in the morning? Do you want to have it in the afternoon? You know, take a vote if it's, you know, something that you can do that on. Certainly when they do like standardized testing, you can't take a vote on when you'd like to do that. But, you know, some of the other things that we do day to day, we can give children choices. You know, shared goal setting. When I worked in an inpatient unit, we started the day with everybody setting a goal. Even if the goal was, today I'm not going to end up in the quiet room, or today I'm not going to yell at anybody. Simple goals. And then at the end of the day, we regroup and say, how did everybody do with their goal? So again, and then staff being accessible. It's important for kids too. Cultural humility. So we It would be helpful if the staff reflected the racial ethnic makeup of the students. I know that's not always possible, but then when it's not possible, we bring in people to augment those experiences. So we bring in people of the racial ethnic makeup of the children that we're working with, and maybe let them do speaking engagements or helping in the classroom. Goes right into environmental exemplars. You know, so we look around in the environment of who is a positive example of someone of their similar race or ethnic background, and we include that in our teaching. You know, we have people from the different cultures identified as scientists or mathematicians or engineers or things like that. And we do sensitive learning activities. You know, in one of the schools, they had all the children bring in a dish from their culture, and they had a little food gathering. Now, I know that's hard with all the allergies and everything else like that, but sometimes people can bring in, you know, when we get to the holidays, you know, how does your family celebrate the holidays, and bring an example of that. Maybe they bring in a different kind of ornament, or they bring in a different kind of activity. So again, you know, we bring that into the classroom. We allow students to engage in that. You know, culturally sensitive classroom management strategies. You know, there are some cultures where people are yelling all the time. There are some cultures where people are not yelling at all. So when somebody raises their voice, that's very hard for some of those children. So again, we're a little sensitive to those. So what we want to do is, this is the ARC model. Again, this is a model that was created through one of the SAMHSA books on trauma-informed classrooms. And it's really about, again, we've talked about this, building secure attachments between child and caregivers, and you are the caregivers in the school, enhancing that self-regulatory capacities, helping them to self-regulate their emotions as well as us, and increasing their competencies across multiple domains. If we just focus only on reading and writing, then we really don't access all those other domains where so again, this is like a summary of what we talked about. So I'm just going to review some traditional approaches versus trauma-informed. So traditional is when we're angry with a kid or we're frustrated, we say, what's wrong with you? Instead of really saying, what happened? What's going on with you? We use negative labels. Trauma-informed, we talk with understanding. You know, it looks like you're daydreaming today, but tell me what's going on. That when I look at you, I see daydreaming, but that may not be happening with you. Purposeful behaviors. You know, we a lot of times think that children's behavior is purposeful. Sometimes it's really not. Remember that map of the brain and how traumatized children go from stimulus, hypothalamus to response. Sometimes their responses are automatic. That is looking at that trauma-informed approach. Traditional, we focused on the child. Trauma-informed focuses on the environment. We consider the environment. We consider what's going on around the child. We do consider the child, but it's not our focus. Traditional, you know, authority is critical. I have children say to me all the time, I had this teacher in class. Now that's a child who's in their teens who can remember that from a young age. So again, see how our words can really the child. Whereas a trauma-informed is choice and control. How can we do this? Do you want to do A or B? What choice do you want to make? You know, traditionally punitive discipline versus trauma-informed, which is positive strength-based. You know, it isn't just punitive. We don't give 3-day suspension because that was the 3rd time you did it. We really try to understand what's going on and what's happening and how can we do things differently. Traditionally, we leave it to the counselor. Send the child to the counselor. Trauma-informed is everyone. Like I keep saying, it's the clerical, it's the administration, it's the custodials, it's the cafeteria workers. It is everyone. It's a shared responsibility and we're all involved. So some of the interventions, we talked about these, you know, making routines, giving kids choices, watching our responses and modeling different reaction, you know, an ability to regulate our emotions and reactions, not taking things personally. You know, the child isn't doing it to you. Being able to identify children's triggers as well as our own. What triggers us? Well, when children don't listen to me, it triggers me. Okay, so I need to know that, because then I need to know what's next. Mentor programs are great. If you can link children with adults in the building, one of the schools did mentor lunches where each teacher had 5 students for like 4 weeks, and then they would rotate and have another 5 students, and they would eat lunch with those students once a week, you know, and time. Traumatized children really think that they're not worth it. They don't think that anybody can help them. So when you give them time, real time, it really makes such an incredible difference. You know, sensitivity to their cues and our cues and triggers, so that we know them. You know, forewarning children, brain breaks. And I call them that when let's take a brain break. Let's everybody sit on the floor cross-legged, close their eyes and breathe for 2 minutes. Or let's sit in our chairs and be rag dolls for a minute and pretend you're a ball of putty and you're just gonna fall into your chair. Getting up and changing seats. Fidgets, when they came out, I thought they were a great idea. And then educators got really annoyed with them, but sometimes you can have a fidget contract with a kid. So the fidget is here, and if you're able to do these things for this amount of time, then you can play with your fidget for 10 minutes. You know, visuals, giving them pictures around or things that can remind them of, you know, things that you want them to do. Building self-regulation skills. I can't tell you how much those breathing exercises and body movements really help kids. When I go into a classroom of teenagers, the first thing I do is I have them stand up and I have them do a couple yoga moves. And they laugh at me and they giggle. But when they sit down, they're in a much different place. They're much more relaxed, you know, and signal plans, you know, signal what kind of plans we're going to have and what's going to happen, and forewarning children, those all go together. Sometimes we need to do things like reduction of assignments and extra time. And those aren't just for our children who have 504s or IEPs. Sometimes regular children need that time and that reduction of assignments. I think the research shows that 10 minutes per day on each subject is the average for most kids to learn something. So again, sometimes children just need a break. That grounding time, that again, being in my body, what we've proven in all the trauma research is that it is all about us getting back into our body and relaxing our minds so that we can focus, so that we can concentrate, so that we can learn. So these are some resources, and you know, I'm not going to read through them, but they're on the PowerPoint and you'll have access to that. So at this point, I think Kadi is monitoring the chat box. If there's any questions that I can answer or questions that you've thought of, I can do that at this time.
Hi, PJ. Well, thank you. So at this time, I want to invite all the participants. We have a relatively small group, so please don't feel shy to ask any questions of our presenter. You could either enter them in the chat box, or you can also send them through the Q&A feature at the bottom menu bar. And then I have some questions for our presenter. So PJ, you spoke about power struggles and trying best to avoid them, because it's not very collaborative. And I know collaboration is one of the tenets of trauma-informed approaches. So in a classroom that you know, may be you know, medium-sized classroom and average size, how would you say is best to approach a power struggle with maybe just a small group of children, 2 or 3, who feel like they haven't had their voice heard or their needs met, and would like to, you know, communicate this to their instructor, to their teacher, but it may be something that may be too sensitive in nature to discuss. Like for instance, an accommodation on schoolwork, the deadline is maybe too soon or something like that, just to alleviate their concerns or anxieties.
So the best way to avoid a power struggle is to be proactive. A lot of times we tend to be reactive as adults and also reactive in schools, and we really need to be proactive. So the best way to avoid a power struggle is to have some of those things in place ahead of time. So sometimes what I recommend in classrooms is that teachers have some kind of format where children can access them with difficult questions or difficult topics, and that might be stickies. They might have stickies where they can write a sticky and have a parking lot like in the back of their classroom, and then the child can put the sticky on the parking lot, or have a place on the teacher's desk where the child can put the sticky, maybe when they're getting up to sharpen their pencil or going to the bathroom or changing classes or things like that. Sometimes, again, giving the children choices in the beginning. You know, you can finish your assignment by Friday and hand it in, and I'll give you 10 extra credit points, or you can take the weekend and hand it in Monday. You know, so again, I offer the choices. I have an incentive on one, the other one I don't, but if a child chooses to use the weekend, they can still hand it in. Their grade doesn't get affected, but they don't get those extra credit points. So I kind of put those things in place ahead of time. Power struggles are usually really avoidable if I can put some of those things in place ahead of time. And again, that's harder to do at the beginning of a school year when you don't know your students. But as you get to know your students, you really will begin to see who will speak up, who won't speak up. And you really want to pull out those kids who may have difficulty, who may want to ask for help but don't know how. Because again, a traumatized child does not think that there's any help for them. So asking for help is really hard for them. So sometimes I need to be able to identify that ahead of time, that that's a child who doesn't raise their hand, who doesn't ask for help, and I need to maybe give them some time with that conversation about, you know, sometimes I see you struggle and you don't raise your hand, you know, what is that about? And they might say to us, I'm too shy to ask you a question, or I don't want the other kids to think I'm stupid. So again, if we have those conversations and we put some of those tools in place, we don't run into that power struggle.
I see. So in a way, you're saying that it's best to empower the child so they can voice their concerns, voice their needs, and they could be their own self-advocates in a way.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
We have a question in here in our Q&A. What are some trauma experiences we are most likely to see when returning after the COVID-19 closure? In your experience? I know some school districts are going to be in a hybrid, some are in a remote learning, some students are giving a choice. So I guess in general, what are some trauma experiences that we will see?
So what we're seeing, and we're seeing it a little now, is that we're going to see a lot of anxiety. So for children who already had anxiety, that's going to be exponentially increased. For children who didn't have it and who may be developing it because of, you know, news broadcasts, or because maybe somebody in their family died of COVID, you're going to see a lot of anxiety. We're going to see a lot, and I don't know that you will see it, you might see the signs and symptoms. We know that domestic violence and substance abuse is increasing, and most times that does result in child abuse or neglect, either emotionally or physically. And so you might see some of the signs and symptoms of that. You may not necessarily see like bruises on a child, or emotional abuse is one of the hardest ones to see. And that's where we really have to look at those signs and symptoms, because we do have parents who are out of work, and parents who are frustrated, and parents who are trying to make it from, you know, one check to the next if one of them got laid off, and parents who are trying to maintain their families and their homes with very little resources. And that all trickles down. So I think you're going to see more depression with some kids. And even our kids who, like, a lot of times we know which kids maybe get free lunch because they have financial difficulties in their families. They're going to have increased difficulties in their families. And so we're really going to have to be very creative in our resources this year. And that's one of the things we're talking to schools about, doing screenings before, you know, in the third week of school to really assess where students are, and then really having some of the resources in place to be able to take care of those needs. you know, because a lot of times when children go home from the summer, they are in, I call it, they're back in their dysfunction, and we don't see them every day. So COVID has been like an extended summer with extreme circumstances. And that's how we have to approach it. So again, I can't stress enough how important it is to really assess where the students are and what's going on with them before we just keep going with the academic piece. Because if they're not with us emotionally and mentally, they're not going to be with us cognitively and academically. Does that answer your question, or is there something else you were looking for?
So the same person submitted another question. So I'm sure she will let us know. In addition to what you were saying, I think as well, a lot of grief. A lot of students will be grieving in one way or another, the loss of either someone very significant to them, a parent or a grandmother, grandfather, brother, sister, aunt, uncle. So I guess also in cultivating that awareness that the students will be maybe in the grieving process as well.
Absolutely. And the grief is not only going to be because they lost maybe a parent or a grandparent. There is also grief over loss of, friendships and loss of rituals. So, a lot of my juniors right now who are coming back, this is their senior year, and they're already experiencing what we're calling anticipatory grief, because they're really anticipating that their proms are going to be canceled and their graduations are going to be different. And so we're also dealing with that grief in terms of loss of some of those ritualistic things that children are used to. My fifth graders that I've been working with were very upset because they lost their end of year trips and field days and things like that. And we sort of look at those as, adults, well, they can go play all they want, but children really look forward to some of these events, and because they've been canceled, it's been a loss for them. So the grief is even more widespread than just individuals who lost loved ones to COVID. It's more widespread than that. And we're really going to have to be paying attention to those signs and symptoms. And again, having conversations with children. I don't think we can start the school year without having a conversation with our children about where they are, how they're feeling about this whole COVID and social distancing, if it affected their family, how it affected their family. I think that's a conversation that we have to have with the children, because otherwise we're not going to know where their heads are at. And that's information that's only going to help us as providers.
Absolutely. We have another question. What are some strategies we can use when trying to build relationships with students with social distancing mandates while maintaining confidentiality?
Just say that one more time. What are some?
Sure. What are some strategies we can use when trying to build relationships with students with social distancing mandates while maintaining confidentiality?
Okay, so there are a couple things that I'm aware of right now. So, and these are things that we're using in the field. So one of them is there are plexiglass windows that are huge, big size windows that people can get for their offices so that you can still be in the same office with the child. The other thing that is being discussed is having 2 rooms where you're in one room and the child is in another room, and you're doing a Zoom back and forth with 2 computers. That's another strategy that we can use. And sometimes, as crazy as it sounds, some of the children really like the idea of using the whiteboard and the chat room when you're doing a Zoom. So they're writing back and forth to you. And that's really been helpful, because then again, when I'm doing home therapy with a child and they're in their house, they sometimes feel like their parents are listening and they don't have the privacy that they had when they came to my office. So they're using the chat room with me and the whiteboard in Zoom. So only I can see what they're writing, and we can have a whole conversation and their parents can't hear a thing. So that's another strategy as well. Sometimes that is helpful. Does that help? Does it answer the question?
So I'm looking at our chat box. I again would like to invite anyone to pose a question to our presenter, or you can either send it in through the Q&A. Any questions, comments, observations, reactions is also welcome. PJ, if you don't mind, if you could move the slide to our evaluation QR code, please. So while we're going to wait for a couple of minutes, if anybody has any questions, any additional questions, this is our evaluation QR code. As I mentioned before, the MHTTC network is funded through SAMHSA to provide this training. And then as part of receiving this funding, we're required to submit data related to the quality of this event. So we appreciate that you please take this brief survey. It'll take less than a minute to complete. Also, we will send a link containing our presenter slides, the audio recording of this presentation, and a certificate of completion that will be coming in the next couple of days. And then if you have any questions for PJ that may come up after this presentation, I will also include her contact information in the email.
And if there's other things that people feel like they need, like you asked, how do we maintain confidentiality and still build that relationship? You know, we're coming up with ideas all the time. If there's other things that you feel that your school would benefit from, or things that you need help with, you know, just email me or put that in the chat box, or, you know, reach out to us and we'll try to get back to you with some of that information. One of the positive things about the MHTC network is that we have a network all across the United States. So we have access to people in very different areas of the United States who are doing really good things, and we can access that information and that material as well. So sometimes when people have a question that I per se can't answer, I reach out to my network and we put it out there and we come up with something. So again, you know, feel free to reach out with some of those concerns, questions, queries, whatever. Be happy to help.
Thank you, PJ. So at this time, so we're going to conclude our webinar. We haven't received any other questions. Any final comments? Okay. PJ, any final comments from you?
No, thank you all of you for being here, and good luck as we start the school year, however it looks, and everyone stay safe yourselves.
Thank you. And same here. Good luck, everyone. And we hope you stay safe and well. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.